Well, Mr. Chairman, Tim, distinguished guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you firstly for coming to my ECR-sponsored conference today, which is an illustration of how our work in the European Parliament and that of individual nations intertwines. As a pro-Brexit MEP who campaigned vigorously for my own redundancy, I see it as my role in life now to try and facilitate the best deal we can for both the UK and the EU in the short time we have left. We need to assist the process of changing our relationship from membership of the EU to one of very close partners cooperating daily on trade, economics, foreign affairs, politics, counter-terrorism and security. We too, what Monsieur Barnier called yesterday, a most ambitious trade deal with the UK. The conference was timed to fall just before the vital December EU Council Summit of Leaders and its vital preparatory papers, which will decide on whether sufficient progress has been made on money, EU citizens and the Northern Ireland border to start negotiating a trade deal. It aims to look at the trade models available once and if we get to negotiating a trade relationship between the UK and the EU, from the deal side as well as from the no-deal side. I think by the end of the year, we'll know whether Britain will be heading for deal or no deal. But of course we mean no trade deal, but not no deals at all. In reality, as with Canada, there are a number of deals to be struck, such as on aviation, data, investment, customs, immigration, perhaps. Remember that if there is no trade deal, we can still negotiate to conclude these kind of non-trade deals. But we must all think carefully if we want 30 to 40% tariffs on French or British cheeses, 45% tariffs on meat, 10% tariffs on nearly 900,000 German cars, or 12% tariffs on wine from France, Italy or Spain. Civitas, I think they're here today, they estimate if tariffs return, the UK will be paying $5 billion in tariff compensation, but the UK will be paying $13 billion, and that money comes to London, not Brussels. Now, having spent 10 years on the Trade Committee of the European Parliament, I've worked on deals like Canada, the Indian Free Trade Agreement, the forthcoming New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. I've just come back from there, meeting a lot of trade bodies, and on Colombia, Peru, South Korea, and Japan. I have some knowledge and insight, hopefully, into the kind of trade deals the EU does and how it actually does them. As a keen Brexiteer, I always knew that Brexit would actually boil down to trade and the nature of a trade deal, and I've tried to learn as much as possible about these in my time. Now, the brief from the British government is a new deep and special partnership and a comprehensive trade deal. I have to say an apology, first of all, that trade deals can be very complex, very technical, detailed, and pretty dull. There are often a whole list of chapters, protocols, and annexes linked to a whole number of other legalese and other agreements. This is a lawyer's paradise. But bear with me, because cracking this lies at the very heart of Brexit talks and our future relationship with the EU. It is why we are in full negotiation on the cash needed to meet our obligations. We seek to conclude a trade deal with the EU, once again, as a free, sovereign and independent nation, rather like Canada and its new relationship with the EU and New Zealand and Australia, where negotiations are about to start. All three of those countries are English-speaking, Queen-admiring, English law-abiding, free-trading and cricket-playing nations. All self-governing, but want to have friendly and close trade and political cooperation with the EU. But all roads do lead to trade. Our Prime Minister rightly said in Florence that she does not want to see, quote, a stark and unimaginative choice between two models, either something based on the EEA membership or a traditional free trade agreement, such as the EU has recently negotiated with Canada. She called the Canada deal the most advanced free trade agreement the EU has yet concluded and a breakthrough in trade between Canada and the EU. But she rightly caveated it by saying, compared with what exists between Britain and the EU today, it would nevertheless represent a restriction on our mutual market access that it would benefit neither of our economies. Not only that, it would start from the false premise that there's no pre-existing regulatory relationship between us. She also called for Renaissance-style creativity. So this gives us the parameters to which we must work. In this section, I want to present to you in some detail a proposed model of association I call Super Canada, which may not sound like Florentine's David, but is indeed based on that recently agreed Canada-CETA deal, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, but which is wider, deeper, and better, importantly including far more on services than for Canada, and particularly on financial services. By the way, please don't buy the propaganda that it took 7 years to negotiate. Negotiations were actually 3 years, with 4 years wasted on rows over human rights and investor protection. Canada had 16,500 goods tariffs to get rid of alone during these negotiations, though many were zero-rated. But Britain starts from a very different place. We have no tariffs to negotiate away. We have no quotas to end or laws to converge. The repeal bill will actually make all EU laws UK laws. But before discussing trade, I just want to point to the companion to the trade deal, rather like Jupiter following the moon, which is the non-trade political agreement that goes hand in hand with the CETA trade deal. And this is called the Strategic Partnership Agreement, or SPA. The SPA covers cooperation on aspects such as justice, security, defense, counterterrorism, foreign affairs, common democratic values, cooperation in multilateral organizations like the United Nations, and sustainable development. I call them MAPs, that is, motherhood and apple pie deals, because they're pretty non-controversial. It's a kind of agreement mirrored in the EU-Australian Framework Agreement, signed in August this year by the EU, and the new EU-New Zealand PARC Agreement, that's the Partnership Agreement on Relations and Cooperation, which I and the European Parliament, and there's many MEPs here today, who voted through last week. In my view, these are all useful templates for a EU-UK political agreement, our own strategic partnership agreement. These have, for example, an institutional framework of close international cooperation, including technical committees for regulatory cooperation and joint committees or joint ministerial committees where experts, ministers or prime ministers can continue to meet. So SPA is a good template for a non-trade political deal. Turning now then to the trade side, let me just put it in context, if I may. Firstly, the EU does trade deals, but it works within a much larger rules-based system established by the WTO, the World Trade Organization, with its 164 members and observers. Now, Britain is a member of the WTO in its own right and will regain its place on its powerful technical committees, as the Minister so ably said earlier. The WTO describes itself as a forum for governments to negotiate trade agreements. In short, the WTO is a spring that feeds into the rivers of trade deals worldwide, including all the EU trade deals. The agreements made by the WTO are incorporated into these EU trade agreements. So, for example, in the CETA deal, you will see the WTO's General Agreement on Trade and Services, that's GATS, and that pops up in CETA's Chapter 9. It's the WTO, not the EU, which sets the simple fundamental principles, as the WTO puts it, that are the foundation of the multilateral trading system. Do not forget, any trade deal really is about the WTO. That's the framework. The EU and UK as WTO members must follow its rules, guidance, and agreements in whatever trade deal we do end up doing, and it has its own court or appellate body, as with the non-ending Airbus and Boeing subsidy disputes, and I think Airbus is here today, so sympathy to that. Any free trade agreement between the EU and UK will have to have WTO approval. And you have to remember, an FTA is a licensed form of discrimination. It actually gives better terms than allowed under the most favoured nation. You've probably heard MFN terms. As those rules state, you can give no more favourable terms to another WTO member unless through an FTA. So you have to ensure that 90% of tariffs are removed in general. The EU has 4 types of trade deals: the old basic first-generation agreements, the deep and comprehensive free trade areas like Ukraine. It has the economic partnership agreements, EPAs, which give access to the single market to countries like Africa, developing nations. And fourthly, and most relevantly to us, is the new generation or modern deals, which cover Colombia, Peru, Singapore, South Korea, and Canada. The reality on trade deals is you don't have unlimited choices. While the UK does want a bespoke deal, the main templates to draw from are limited, as we'll see at this conference. We have the EEA option, and Helle Hagenau from Norway is going to speak about that, used by Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. The Swiss option, which is touching on that as well. The Turkish goods custom option. The Ukraine option, which sadly contributed to starting a war, which is not a good recommendation. And then there is a no deal that is actually a deal, that is WTO rules, because WTO rules is an arrangement, but it's not a free trade agreement. It's not an agreement. The EU is asking, perhaps reasonably, which one of these we actually want, which brings me to Canada. Now, Canada's CETA is a great deal, and I helped get it through the Parliament and met President Trudeau, Justin Trudeau. It's interesting, the Canadian government describes this as a progressive free trade agreement which covers virtually all sectors and aspects of Canada-EU trade in order to eliminate or reduce barriers. Prior to CETA's entry into force, only 25% of EU tariff lines of Canadian goods were duty-free. Upon CETA's entry into force, the EU will remove tariffs on 98% of its tariff lines. And once CETA is fully implemented, the EU will have eliminated tariffs on 99% of its tariff lines. And this is in contrast, Canada is the 12th largest trading partner with the EU. Britain is the largest single trading partner of the rest of the EU 27. So let's just start briefly with what the EU regards as good about CETA and its own publicity. It sees it as modern, comprehensive, a gold standard deal is how they describe it, and it sees it actually summarizes it as leveling the playing field on the Canadian market for EU companies. That's how it sees free trade agreements. It eliminates tariffs, as I said, on all industrial products, over 2/3 of tariffs on fishing and 90% on agricultural goods. And it doesn't require Canada to make a financial contribution, as Andrew Neil pointed out the other day. There's no free movement in CETA, as there's none in NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement either. But it does allow for transfers of company staff and other professionals on a temporary basis, for architects, for example, and bankers, as David Davis mentioned just to the Germans just this week. This section is related to Mode 4 of the WTO's Service Agreement, GATS. And on standards, CETA will not change EU standards. It boasts this. It related to food safety, product safety, consumer protection, health, environment, social and labour standards. They will remain untouched. That's what the EU says. And it eliminates, it helps with double testing, as it's called. So they accept each other's conformity assessment certificates on things like electrical goods and machinery and toys. It's the most far-reaching agreement ever concluded in the area of services and investment. It's not true that there's nothing on services in CETA. There's quite a lot. And it opens up postal, telecommunications, maritime markets, and public procurement, not just at federal level, but in the provinces. And on IP, on intellectual property, it protects copyright, pharmaceutical and other properties, and geographical indicators. The EU loves these things, GIs, to protect Roquefort cheese or champagne or Parma ham or balsamic vinegar, all of which we all consume here in great quantities, of course. And it has a mutual recognition of professionals for architects, accountants, engineers. There's a long list. Basically say if you're qualified in Canada, you can work in the EU. And that's something we definitely would want to see in a UK deal. Just to finish up then on Canada, the EU likes CETA as a trade model. CETA is the basis for a deal with both New Zealand and Australia. This is hot news, it's just happening. I've been told that the New Zealand deal will actually take on board 80% of CETA without much issue, and the other 20% will be negotiable. Australia, too, is using the CETA template, and the EU encourages this. Now, I know that lawyers are sometimes uncomfortable with the notion of templates, as this may distract from large fees. But the reality is that trade deals around the world have a great element of templates built in, and the ingredients are much the same. Those WTO agreements I touched on are turned into chapters in these deals, and it's very relevant also to turn existing EU trade deals like South Korea into bilateral UK deals post-Brexit, as the Trade Minister made clear. So, dare I say, there's quite an element of cut and paste to these deals. So what I call Super Canada, or some call CETA Plus, or CETA Plus Plus, or even CETA Plus Plus Plus, takes the bespoke deal closer to EEA, the European Economic Area, which Norway has. It might be a case of EEA minus, minus, minus. But the point is there is continuing here between CETA on the one hand and the EEA on the other. And we need a deal that lies somewhere between those two, which goes much further, deeper and wider than Canada. Now, ladies and gentlemen, just to wind up with a few bits of detail, I'm putting on my website now at 11 o'clock, well, my designer is, I'm not doing it here personally, but it's a paper, a detailed paper that compares CETA with what I call Super Canada, and what needs to change and what doesn't need to change. Very briefly in the details, 12 out of the 30 chapters in CETA would need hardly any change at all. Of the other 18, most need minor changes, but 7 would need substantial writing, and I think this is important. In electrical communications and data protection, because we're much closer to the EU on that area, we might need a separate data deal. Government procurement, we might want to protect the NHS, that's a political issue. Intellectual property, geographical indicators, as I say, the EU is very keen on that and wants that in the British deal. Regulatory cooperation, this came up with Mr. Barnier again yesterday. He's worried that we'll go off and become like Singapore. It's not the case, but you can have regulatory committees that assess how divergent you're becoming of regulation. And then there's sanctions on trade and sustainable development, which I do oppose. They're trying to do it to New Zealand and Australia, where basically if the EU thinks that Britain is not actually fulfilling environmental obligations, then they can fine us or reoppose tariffs. Bilateral cooperation and dialogues, that's where we put EU programs we want to stay in, like Horizon 2020, I'd recommend, the research program and Erasmus for students, and EU agencies such as the European Space Agency we might want to stay in. Finally, the speed of the agreement, if you take investment out of it and investment protection, and someone here has already mentioned the dreaded ISDS, Investor-State Dispute Settlement, which brought down the TTIP deal, if you remember the American deal. If you take that out, which is what the EU is proposing to do on New Zealand and Australia, then actually the EU itself can actually agree this trade deal. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very quick run through the existing Canada-CETA deal and how it can serve as a template for the wider, bigger and better Super Canada deal I propose, including services. I do believe that Super Canada is attractive, deliverable and positive for all, and I recommend it to you today. Thank you.